Renowned American economist and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University Jeffrey Sachs wrote a brilliant article titled "The War in Ukraine Was Provoked and Why That Matters to Achieve Peace." In this video, I'm going to shed light on this important opinion article because, as Professor Sachs argued, by recognizing that the question of NATO enlargement is at the center of this war, we understand why US weaponry will not end this war and why only diplomatic efforts can achieve peace. Regarding the Ukraine war, the Biden administration has repeatedly and falsely claimed that the Ukraine war started with an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine on February 24. In fact, the war was provoked by the US in ways that leading US diplomats anticipated for decades in the lead up to the war, meaning that the war could have been avoided and should now be stopped through negotiations. There were in fact two main US provocations. The first was the US intention to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia in order to surround Russia in the Black Sea region by NATO countries, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia in counter-clockwise order. The second was the US role in installing a Russophobic regime in Ukraine by the violent overthrow of Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014. The shooting war in Ukraine began with Yanukovych's overthrow 9 years ago, not in February 2022 as the US government, NATO, and the G7 leaders would have us believe. To recognize them would undermine the administration in three ways. First, it would expose the fact that the war could have been avoided or stopped early, sparing Ukraine its current devastation and the US more than $100 billion in outlays to date. Second, it would expose President Biden's personal role in the war as a participant in the overthrow of Yanukovych and before that, as a staunch backer of the military-industrial complex and very early advocate of NATO enlargement. Third, it would push Biden to the negotiating table, undermining the administration's continued push for NATO expansion. The archives show irrefutably that the US and German governments repeatedly promised to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward when the Soviet Union disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance. Nonetheless, US planning for NATO expansion began early in the 1990s, well before Vladimir Putin was Russia's president. In 1997, national security expert Brzezinski spelled out the NATO expansion timeline with remarkable precision. US diplomats and Ukraine's own leaders knew well that NATO enlargement could lead to war. President Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense William Perry considered resigning in protest against NATO enlargement. In reminiscing about the crucial moment in the mid-1990s, Perry said the following in 2016. Our first action that really set us off in a bad direction was when NATO started to expand, bringing in Eastern European nations, some of them bordering Russia. Ukraine's leaders knew clearly that pressing for NATO enlargement to Ukraine would mean war. Former Zelensky advisor Oleksiy Arestovich declared in a 2019 interview that our price for joining NATO is a big war with Russia.
То есть, если Украина получает ПДЧ в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны?
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно брали.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно. Нет, не НАТО. Мы не они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО.
During 2010-2013, Yanukovych pushed neutrality in line with the Ukrainian public opinion. The US worked covertly to overthrow Yanukovych, as captured vividly in the tape of then US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Payette, planning the post-Yanukovych government weeks before the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. Nuland makes clear on the call that she was coordinating closely with then Vice President Joe Biden and his National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the same Biden-Nuland-Sullivan team now at the center of US policy vis-à-vis Ukraine. After Yanukovych's overthrow, the war broke out in the Donbass, while Russia claimed Crimea. The new Ukrainian government appealed for NATO membership, and the US armed and helped restructure the Ukrainian army to make it interoperable with NATO. In 2021, NATO and the Biden administration strongly recommitted to Ukraine's future in NATO. In the immediate lead up to Russia's invasion, NATO enlargement was center stage. Putin's draft US-Russia treaty on December 17, 2021 called for a halt to NATO enlargement. Russia's leaders put NATO enlargement as the cause of war in Russia's National Security Council meeting. In his address to the nation that day, Putin declared NATO enlargement to be a central reason for the invasion. While the Biden administration declares Russia's invasion to be unprovoked, Russia pursued diplomatic options in 2021 to avoid war, while Biden rejected diplomacy, insisting that Russia had no say whatsoever on the question of NATO enlargement. And Russia pushed diplomacy in March 2022, while the Biden team again blocked a diplomatic end to the war. By recognizing that the question of NATO enlargement is at the center of this war, we understand why US weaponry will not end this war. Russia will escalate as necessary to prevent NATO enlargement to Ukraine. The key to peace in Ukraine is through negotiations based on Ukraine's neutrality and NATO non-enlargement. The Biden administration's insistence on NATO enlargement to Ukraine has made Ukraine a victim of misconceived and unachievable US military aspirations. It is time for the provocations to stop and for negotiations to restore peace to Ukraine.
Entry, invasion as unprovoked. This whole issue of being an unprovoked war.
I noted that the New York Times has used the word unprovoked regarding this invasion 26 times in its editorials, its opinion columns, and its invited guest op-eds. They don't talk about the truth, which is that our own diplomats, I'm talking about U.S. diplomats, including CIA Director William Burns, who wrote a memo that was released by WikiLeaks in 2008. His 2008 memo said, this is existential from Russia's point of view. If we continue to push NATO enlargement to Ukraine, this could have absolutely dire consequences. Our diplomats have known this all along, but it's been the politicians, it's been the military-industrial complex, it's been the big companies that have been championing NATO enlargement. That's a lot of weapon sales if you do that. Even though the risks are completely understood inside the government by serious people, they're just not heeded. And this has been true about Ukraine all along. And up until the end of 2021, Vladimir Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement that was based on don't expand NATO to Ukraine. And that has been Russia's refrain for 30 years. And yet we don't heed it. And now we're 113 billion into this. It is horrible for Ukraine. We've trapped yet another country in the middle of our lobbying campaigns because this isn't going to work out well for Ukraine. It's a disaster. It's like how it worked out for Afghanistan. So this is what's really going on. And I wish that the New York Times would carry some truth in this to explain what this is really about.